Part 1. The Seduction of Light and Shadow. There's a moment in every empath's life when they meet someone who feels like destiny. The connection is electric, magnetic, almost cosmic. It feels like coming home to a soul you didn't know you were missing. But something lurks behind that intensity as shadow. And by the time you recognize it, you're already entangled. This is not just a love story gone wrong. This is an archetypal dance between the empath and the narcissist, a psychological journey that Carl Jung himself would say is not merely personal, but mythological. A journey through the unconscious, through projection and possession, through the deepest terrains of the human psyche. You might wonder, why does this happen to empaths in particular? Because empaths are mirrors. They absorb energy, feel emotions deeply, and resonate with the pain of others. They are healers by nature. But what they often forget is that light attracts both beauty and darkness. The narcissist is not drawn to the empath's weakness, but to their strength, to their radiance, to their capacity for love, forgiveness, and depth. The narcissist sees in the empath what they cannot access in themselves. And so begins the first stage, the seduction, or a phase that feels like falling in love, but is in fact a psychological enchantment. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is the tragic truth behind the empath's suffering. They believe they've found fate, but they've actually found a projection. What they fall in love with is not the narcissist's true self, but the mask, the false self, the grand illusion. Narcissists are masters of mirroring. They observe you, reflect your desires, and mold themselves into your ideal partner. It's not real love, it's psychological mimicry. And the empath, so eager to be seen, mistaken this mimicry for genuine connection. In the early days, the narcissist will shower the empath with attention, affection, and validation. It's called love bombing, and it is intoxicating. The empath feels elevated, chosen, finally understood. What they don't realize is that they're being studied. Every vulnerability, every need, every wound is being mapped out for future exploitation. The narcissist is building a psychological blueprint, not to love but to control. But how could the empath know? They are not naive, but they are pure. They believe in goodness, and that belief becomes the very thing that blinds them.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Here's the paradox. The empath doesn't fall for the narcissist because they're foolish, but because they're hopeful. They believe in redemption, in healing, in love that transforms. And so they ignore the red flags, in the subtle manipulations, the inconsistencies. They justify, rationalize, forgive. Because they're not just in love with a person, they're in love with a potential. But potential is dangerous when projected onto someone who has no intention of evolving. The empath is not in denial of reality, they are in denial of their own limits, believing they can love someone into wholeness. Now pause for a moment, ask yourself this. Have you ever fallen in love with someone's potential rather than their reality? And if so, what did it cost you? As the seduction deepens, the empath begins to lose themselves. Slowly, subtly, their needs diminish, their boundaries blur. their identity starts to dissolve into the narcissist's desires. This is not love, it's psychological merging. And it's the beginning of the second stage, the erosion of self. Carl Jung would call this the beginning of shadow work, the confrontation with what we've repressed, denied, or projected. And in the empath's case, it's the realization that their light alone is not enough to save someone who is committed to their own illusion. Jung also warned us of the danger of inflation when one identifies too closely with the archetype of the savior, the healer, the light bringer. The empath, in their spiritual pride, may believe they were meant to save the narcissist, that this suffering is part of some divine test. But this belief is not wisdom, it's a trap. It keeps them in a cycle of self-sacrifice that only feeds the narcissist's ego. And so the empath gives more and more, until the giving becomes self-destruction. In mythology, this is the moment the hero enters the underworld, the moment of descent. The mask begins to slip. The narcissist's charm fades, replaced by criticism, gaslighting, and emotional withdrawal. The empath, once adored, is now devalued. Infused, they try harder. They blame themselves. What they don't realize is that they are now locked in a psychological prison. The narcissist controls the narrative. And the empath, desperate to restore what once was, becomes complicit in their own erasure. And yet this stage is sacred, because it is here, in the darkness, that true transformation begins. You see, pain is not the end, it is the portal. The narcissist is not just a villain, they are a mirror, reflecting back to the empath all the wounds they have yet to heal. The abandonment, the unworthiness, the belief that love must be earned. And that is the hidden gift of this encounter. It forces the empath to confront the unconscious, to awaken, to remember who they were before they began to seek themselves in someone else's eyes. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The empath-narcissist dynamic is not meaningless. It is alchemical. But not all transformations are gentle. Some require fire. And in this fire, the empath will either burn away their illusions or lose themselves entirely. That is the choice. That is the crucible. So why do we return to the pain? Why do empaths stay? Because the soul clings to meaning. And the narcissist offers just enough hope, just enough warmth, to keep the empath believing that the story isn't over, that healing is still possible. But healing cannot be one-sided. It requires mutual responsibility. And the narcissist, trapped in their own illusion of superiority, is unwilling to descend. The empath must go alone. This is where the real initiation begins. When the empath stops asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and starts asking, "Why did I allow it?" This is not victim blaming, it is soul reclamation. The empath must take responsibility, not for the abuse, but for their own healing. They must stop waiting for closure from the one who broke them, and instead become the one who closes the door. Here's a question that cuts straight to the soul. What part of you believes that love must come at the cost of yourself? This is not the end of the journey. This is only the first stage, the seduction, the descent, the unraveling. But we must continue. because the next stage is where the real war begins, not with the narcissist, but with the self. The ego, the wound, the shadow. And in that battle, the empath must become something far more powerful than they ever imagined. Part 2. The War of Identity in the Shadow Self. The second stage is where the illusion truly begins to collapse. The empath, once lost in the fantasy of love, now finds themselves in emotional warfare. Nothing makes sense anymore. The person who once adored them now belittles them, gaslights them, manipulates them into questioning their own memories, their own sanity, their own worth. This is not merely heartbreak, this is psychological fragmentation. The empath is no longer just dealing with abuse. They are confronting the disintegration of their identity. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes unavoidable. You see, the empath's suffering is more than emotional. It is archetypal. They are being forced to confront their repressed selves, the parts they've disowned, abandoned, denied. In the beginning, the empath believed they were only love, only light, only giver. But now, through the narcissist's manipulation, they are forced to see another side, their anger, their resentment, their fear, their rejection. This is the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds everything we refuse to look at. And until this shadow is acknowledged, it will continue to manifest externally, often in the form of toxic relationships. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the stage where the empath must begin to make their own darkness conscious. The narcissist has become a mirror to their unconscious wounds. Not because they are wise, but because they are wounded in a way that activates the empath's own trauma. The narcissist does not create the empath's pain, they reveal it. And once revealed, it cannot be unseen. This is when the empath either begins the journey of individuation or falls deeper into the cycle of self-abandonment. The war of identity begins here. The empath is pulled between two selves, the one they used to be and the one they're becoming. On one side is the old self, people-pleasing, overgiving, conflict-avoiding, addicted to validation. On the other, the emerging self-aware, assertive, boundary-setting, unwilling to shrink for love. But growth is painful. Every time the empath tries to stand up for themselves, the narcissist escalates the manipulation. They play the victim. They twist reality. They make the empath feel guilty for evolving. And so the empath begins to question, am I becoming cruel, unloving, cold? No, they are becoming whole. This is the essential truth. Healing often feels like breaking, because we are shedding identities that were never truly ours. The empath has to grieve not just the relationship, but the version of themselves who tolerated it. And that grief is profound. It comes in waves. Some days they feel powerful. Other days they feel shattered. This is not weakness, it is rebirth. The caterpillar dissolves inside the cocoon before becoming a butterfly. And the empath, too, must dissolve. Their identity must melt so that something stronger, wiser, more integrated can emerge. In this stage, confusion reigns. The narcissist uses silence as a weapon. They disappear, reappear, blame the empath for every failure. The empath, desperate for clarity, becomes addicted to apology, to closure, to chasing the version of the narcissist they once knew. But here's the brutal truth. The narcissist never existed, at least not in the way the empath believed. The narcissist was always wearing a mask. And now that mask is gone. What remains is a person who cannot love because they cannot see anyone beyond their own ego. Jung warned us of this danger. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The narcissist cannot do this. They have built their entire personality on avoidance, avoiding shame, vulnerability, introspection. And so when the empath begins to awaken, to set boundaries, to demand truth, the narcissist retaliates with cruelty. Not because the empath is wrong, but because they are breaking the illusion. To the narcissist, that is unforgivable. But this is where the empath must stay strong. They must recognize that love without boundaries is not love, it is martyrdom. And martyrdom disguised as love is one of the most dangerous traps of all. The empath must stop betraying themselves to maintain peace. They must reclaim their voice, their space, their truth. And this requires immense courage, because every boundary feels like a battle. Every no feels like abandonment. But the real abandonment happened long before, when they abandoned themselves for someone else's comfort. Let's speak of loneliness. In this stage, loneliness is a constant companion. The empath feels isolated, misunderstood, emotionally exhausted. Friends may not understand. Family may urge reconciliation. Society romanticizes forgiveness without accountability. But the empath must walk this part of the path alone. This is the initiation. This is the hero's descent into the underworld. And like all mythological heroes, they must face their demons not to destroy them, but to integrate them. There will be moments of doubt, of longing, of weakness. The narcissist may reach out with breadcrumbs of affection, a text, a memory, a fabricated apology. But this is not love, it is control. The empath must remember, the narcissist does not miss them. They miss the supply, the attention, the devotion, the energy. The empath must resist, not out of hatred, but out of self-respect. This is the stage where the empath begins to reclaim their reality. They start journaling, reflecting, going to therapy, practicing silence. The fog begins to lift. They start to see the patterns not just with the narcissist, but throughout their life. Childhood wounds come into focus. Old narratives dissolve. They begin to realize, I was trained to ignore myself. I was conditioned to believe that love meant sacrifice. And this realization is both heartbreaking and liberating, because now they can choose differently. Jung believed in the process of individuation, the integration of all aspects of the self, both light and shadow. And this is exactly what the empath is now doing. They are no longer trying to be only good, only kind, only giving. They are allowing themselves rage, boundaries, truth, clarity. They are becoming whole. And in that wholeness, they find something the narcissist will never have: self-awareness, authenticity, peace. Here's a piercing question to reflect on. What part of your identity depends on being needed by someone else? The empath must grieve the illusion. They must say goodbye not only to the narcissist, but to the fantasy they created. That fantasy was never just about the other person, it was about their own longing to be seen, loved, healed. And now they must learn to give those things to themselves. This is not selfishness, it is sacred responsibility. So what does this stage teach us? That pain is a portal. That survival is not the goal, transformation is. That boundaries are not walls, they are bridges to self-respect. That the shadow is not our enemy, it is our guide. And that healing is not about returning to who we were, it's about becoming who we were meant to be before the world told us to shrink. The war of identity is brutal, but it is also beautiful. Because in this battle, the empath finds their sword, not to hurt, but to protect, not to dominate, but to liberate. They learn to love themselves fiercely, and that love becomes their new foundation. And so we move forward. There is one more stage, a final ascent, the moment of integration, of power, of peace. And in that stage, the empath becomes something far more than a survivor, they become a sage. Part 3. The rebirth of the sovereign self. This is the final stage, the return. The empath has walked through the fire, faced the shadow, and survived the psychological war. But now, something even more profound begins to unfold. Healing is no longer a distant hope, it becomes a lived reality. The empath begins to reclaim their life, not as a wounded being searching for love, but as a sovereign soul who remembers their worth. This is not the same person who once kneeled at the altar of the narcissist's approval. This is someone entirely new, transformed, integrated, whole. Carl Jung described the final phase of individuation as the synthesis of opposites, the union of the conscious and unconscious, the light and the shadow, the masculine and the feminine. The empath, having faced their trauma and integrated their darkness, no longer views themselves as a victim. They have transcended the need to be seen as only good. They have stopped trying to save others in order to feel valuable. And perhaps most importantly, they have stopped looking for love that requires them to bleed. This stage is not about revenge, it's about resurrection. In this sacred phase, the empath reclaims their power through presence. They no longer chase closure, they create it. They no longer explain their boundaries, they embody them. The narcissist, sensing this change, may attempt to return, but they are no longer speaking to the same person. The empath's energy has shifted. Their soul no longer vibrates on the same frequency of desperation and sacrifice. Instead, it resonates with clarity, self-respect, and deep inner peace. This inner transformation cannot be faked. It is felt by everyone. There is a moment, often quiet, often alone, when the empath realizes they no longer miss the narcissist. Not because they've forgotten, but because they've remembered themselves. The grief has been metabolized into wisdom. The pain has become their teacher. And now, they walk through life with a different kind of power, the power of someone who has descended into the depths of their psyche and returned with the treasure of self-awareness. This is the Jungian process of the hero's return, not triumphant in ego, but radiant in truth. In this stage, the empath may find themselves shedding more than just the narcissist. Old friendships, outdated beliefs, toxic patterns all begin to fall away. This is not loss, it is alignment. They are no longer available for emotional crumbs. They are no longer interested in being everything to everyone. They have learned the sacred art of enoughness. And in that enoughness, they attract relationships that are reciprocal, honest, and rooted in mutual respect. No more chasing. No more fixing. Only choosing. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this is exactly what the empath has achieved, not through comfort, but through crisis, not through ease, but through endurance. They have become someone who no longer fears solitude because they have met themselves in the silence. They have stared into the abyss and found their soul staring back. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is the raw truth of psychological rebirth. Let's talk about the new self. The sovereign empath is no longer reactive, they are responsive. They no longer take things personally because they understand projection. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They see manipulation for what it is, a symptom of someone else's emptiness, not a reflection of their own inadequacy. They trust their intuition now. They listen to their body. Their nervous system becomes their compass. Instead of overriding discomfort, they honor it. Instead of doubting themselves, they ground themselves. This stage also brings with it a surprising emotion, compassion. Not for the narcissist's behavior, but for their humanity. The empath, having done the inner work, realizes that the narcissist is not evil, they are asleep, trapped in a wound they refuse to face. And while the empath no longer tolerates the abuse, they also no longer carry the hatred. Because they understand that healing doesn't require vengeance. It only requires truth, and truth has already set them free. There is often a moment in this stage when the empath receives an unexpected message, a text, an email, a passive attempt at reconnection. The narcissist, sensing the loss of control, tries to reclaim what they once had. But the empath no longer feels triggered. They no longer ache. The message does not open old wounds, it confirms the healing. And in that moment, the empath knows they've outgrown the cycle. They've transcended the pattern. They've reclaimed their sovereignty. Now, the empath becomes the teacher, not by preaching, but by living. Their presence becomes medicine for others. People feel safe around them, not because they're perfect, but because they're real, authentic, rooted. They've learned that empathy without boundaries is self-betrayal. And so they model what it means to be both open-hearted and self-honoring. They no longer abandon themselves for love. They bring love to themselves, and from that overflow, they relate to others. Here's a question worth sitting with. Who are you when you no longer need to be needed? This stage is not a final destination, it is an ever-deepening journey. The empath continues to grow, to expand, to evolve. They may still feel moments of sadness, but those moments no longer define them. They may still encounter manipulation, but they see it clearly and respond with grace. Most importantly, they no longer fear their own power. They embrace it. They wield it not to dominate, but to protect. Not to impress, but to express. Jung believed that each of us contains within us the archetypes of the healer, the warrior, the lover, the sage. In this final stage, the empath integrates them all. They are no longer just the healer, they are also the warrior. They are no longer just the lover, they are also the sage. They are no longer fragmented, they are whole. And so we close this journey not with a perfect ending, but with a powerful beginning. Because the empath who has walked through abuse, awakened to truth, and reclaimed their soul is now capable of creating a reality that reflects their inner worth. They no longer look for someone to complete them. They are complete. They no longer fear the shadow. They walk with it. They no longer confuse chaos for love. They choose peace. So to every empath listening, know this: you are not broken. You were never too much. Your heart was not the problem. It was simply unguarded, and now it is strong. Now it is wise. Now it will never again settle for less than what it truly deserves. Carl Jung left us with a final truth: I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. And now you choose. Not survival, not suffering, but sovereignty. This is your rebirth. This is your return. This is your power. Now ask yourself, if you were no longer afraid to be powerful, what kind of life would you create?